And welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Michael Lind, co-founder of the New American Foundation and author of the book, The Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. Michael, just to wrap up what we were talking about in the first segment, and then I want to get into the writing you've been doing about libertarianism and Ayn Rand and all these things. Throughout your book, you talk about, or in your book, you talk about how the United States, the average American, is so much richer than anybody else anywhere else in the world, and speculate about a couple of reasons why that might be. Might one of those reasons be that our continent had been protected and preserved for 20,000 years by people who had learned how to live, at least in large part, in balance with nature? And so when Europeans first showed up, particularly with a new technology that could exploit those natural resources in ways that were new, relatively speaking, Europe had already been mined, a lot of the coal was gone, the forests. I mean, Italy had their great currency crisis in 8200 just simply because they deforested the whole country. That we're rich because we stole all this stuff from the Indians, would be one way to put it, or because it was here.
Well, if you look at the map of advanced industrial societies in the world today, it tends to map onto the temperate biomes of North America, Western Europe, and East Asia, Japan and China.
Temperate places with four seasons.
That's right. And it's certainly true that compared to what we used to be taught, that this was a total wasteland before European settlers arrived. In fact, at least in the eastern United States, there had been flourishing agriculture on the part of the Native Americans. Sure. And that led to richer soils. There had been periodic burnings of forest land, which increased wildlife, as happened with many hunter-gatherer tribes and agricultural societies alike. Even Jamestown was founded in what they thought was a field, but archaeologists think instead of an abandoned field, this actually had been a very densely settled area, which in that case had been depopulated by local warfare. So all of the problems didn't arrive with the Europeans. But certainly the landscape had been changed for 10,000 years during the Ice Age before essentially land was seized from the natives and then used as the basis first for flourishing agriculture. And this is something that we need to remember. Modern science, modern technology, modern industry in the United States were first successfully applied to agriculture, creating the world's richest agriculture sector, exports from which helped to finance our industrialization, which came later.
Right, and that was a time when the topsoil in the United States was 6, 8, 10 feet deep in many places, and European topsoil was largely degraded.
And particularly in the Great Plains, there were inappropriate farming techniques, Western European type farming techniques, which did not apply and led to the disaster of the Dust Bowl. Yeah. And one of the great innovations of the New Deal, we tend to think of it in terms of social insurance, social security, things like that. But it was also natural resource conservation, which had begun with Franklin Roosevelt's cousin Theodore.
Oh, yeah.
And others at the turn of the century, but it was really one of the major tasks of the CCC was to fight two problems simultaneously: youth unemployment, at least young male unemployment, and resource conservation. As late as the 1980s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was trying to revive in Congress a similar program, which the conservatives shot down, saying we can't afford it.
I think reviving the CCC would be a great idea.
Yeah, I do too.
If not then, when? If not now, when? You've been writing a lot lately about the influence of I think her name was Alyssa Rosenbaum when she came from Russia, Ayn Rand. She renamed herself with dreams of coming to America and becoming a famous novelist, which she did. Wrote Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and we can. I sometimes ridicule the quality of her work, but it's really hard to do at the end of the day when you look at how many books are in print. Right, exactly. What is the basis, in your mind, of the worldview that produced what you refer to in Land of Promise as the Great Unraveling? When Carter started deregulating and halfway through his presidential term, and then Reagan put it on steroids, and this constant call for no taxes, no government, drowned it in the bathtub, all this.
Well, I think that the right's own description of it, that this was the rebirth of the true Jeffersonian American tradition or of classical liberalism, is simply wrong. If you look at Jefferson, he would be considered a statist by comparison with today's Tea Party right.
Certainly the way he governed.
Yeah, when it came to support for federal infrastructure, he wanted a tax system in which no poor people paid any taxes, only the rich paid taxes, mainly through customs duties, which were luxury taxes. Yeah. So that's their mythical image of the resurgence of the right. I think that the post-70s rights resurgence throughout the Western world, here and in Thatcher's Britain and in Europe, and particularly since 2008, 2009, the crash, this has a quite different mechanism, and it's the polarization of societies in which growth slows down below the arc at which it was anticipated. So that as long as we had this very booming post-World War II growth, even the 19th century, very high growth, you know, John F. Kennedy's quip, a rising tide lifts all boats. Right. You can ignore distributional issues because the rich are getting richer, the middle class is getting richer, the poor are getting richer. When growth slows down, even if it continues, and it's continuing now, it's just very slow. But even with very slow growth, you're still much richer 50, 70 years down the road. It just takes a longer time to get there. So it's the inflection point. If everyone in the society, and not just in the United States, but in Germany and China and everywhere else, Japan, if you anticipated that your income would be this, but it's only going to be this as a nation, then suddenly everyone starts looking around. You know, it's like a Twilight Zone episode. Okay, if I keep mine, who has to lose theirs? And you get a very, very bitter, nasty kind of internecine struggle between classes, between races, between regions within countries. And this can just tear them apart for generations. And we saw this with what was the original Great Depression, one of what's called the Long Depression of the 1890s. From the 1870s to the 1890s, the worse the economy got, the worse off the liberals and progressives and the socialists of the day were. The big winners in the Long Depression of the 19th century and in the Great Depression of the 1930s, except for a few countries like France and Scandinavia and the United States, were either conservative parties or illiberal, authoritarian, nationalist, racist, anti-Semitic, fascist parties.
Right.
And it's just a sad reflection on human nature that when the pie is shrinking, people tend to try to hold on to their own by throwing other people out of the boat.
So you're describing the J-curve hypothesis, that when expectations diverge from reality to a certain extent, people react with something that looks like revolution or some variation.
Yeah, but it's often a revolution of the right.
And that, exactly, and that revolution is Ayn Rand. Right?
In the United States, it's Ayn Rand. In Western Europe, it's taking the form of more classic ethnic nationalist, anti-immigrant nativism. Right. But even the Ayn Rand stuff, it's not classical liberal, even though they pay lip service to
liberal in the European term.
Yeah, it's really, as Corey Robin, the historian, has pointed out, accurately, I think, it's very Nietzschean and kind of elitist. It's this idea that why should we, the superior few, who deserve what we have, you know, be dragged down into the muck, you know, with, she calls them the looters, you know, Mitt Romney, it's the takers versus the makers. This is a very dark, grim, you know, kind of illiberal vision. It's quite different from the optimism of even the free market liberals of the 19th century.
So what propelled Ayn Rand and her philosophy to, I mean, it really in her own day, she was viewed as kind of a marginal, sort of like Reverend Moon, you know, as a kind of on the edge of things. But now you've got Paul Ryan, you know, passing out her books to his staff. You've got saying she was his inspiration to go into politics. The man who ran for vice president of the United States last time around.
I think it was the genre of fiction, among other things, because there are cases of political movements which happen to be propagated through very successful novels or movies or literary forms.
Tom's Cabin?
The environmental movement. There was this book called Ecotopia back in the 1970s, and I think Oregon and Washington secede from the United States. And now the people living in Portland, living the Portlandian dream, don't realize they're living scenes from this novel. Right. But I think that, in particular, we in journalism and in the academy, we tend to assume that, well, we'll get our message across through nonfiction, through op-eds. But, you know, a good novel, or even a bad novel, actually probably the successive effective propaganda novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Ayn Rand's works, the worse they are as literature, the less subtle they are and the more melodramatic and the dumber and simpler and straightforward their message, the more successful they may be in gaining converts.
Yeah.
So I think the lesson is you want to get your message out there. By all means, write op-eds and policy papers, but you might think about some fiction.
What was the book that inspired Tim McVeigh?
The Turner Diaries.
Turner Diaries, exactly. Yeah, which
of a really
drives,
bad, in that case, evil book.
Yes.
Which had far more influence because it was a novel than 10,000 neo-Nazi pamphlets.
To the Koch brothers, I mean, this philosophy works really, really well for billionaires, and it not only gives them moral rationalization, but also helps add to their billions, as it were, and gets, a whole chorus.
Well, in my misspent youth as a neoconservative back in the 1980s, at one point a donor at one of these foundations that funded neoconservatives said, we need more novels and films and so on. It's very Stalinist, like we need to celebrate the wheat production with a movie. Fortunately, the neocons, they're very good at op-eds. They're terrible at fiction and drama. So we dodged that bullet.
But haven't the Koch brothers promoted Ayn Rand? I mean, the Charles Koch Foundation became the Cato Institute. It's not Ayn Rand entirely. It's the libertarianism. But
yeah, but I don't. Ayn Rand was the libertarian movement was a flourishing subculture even before the Kochs infused money into it. They built it up because it does appeal, to certain elements of the population and certain ideals we may disagree with. It was eclipsed, in retrospect, briefly from about the 1950s until the 1990s by what became known as the modern conservative movement of William F. Buckley Jr. and Goldwater and Reagan. And it had a strain of libertarianism. They were free market, but they also tended to be religious. They were very patriotic, nationalistic. Buckley in the 50s said that, well, as long as the Cold War goes on, we need big government across the board effectively. And that's a price to pay. So I think part of it is the historical fact the Cold War ended, the military right faded away, with the exception of the neocons who were discredited after the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The religious right has faded away, and the libertarians are the one force left standing.
The last man standing. Amazing. Michael, thank you for being with us tonight.